Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we will be reviewing the Pepe Jijon Natural Processed Ecuador from Hydrangea Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Hydrangea, based out of Berkeley, California. And this is their second ever appearance on this channel, having previously reviewed their take on the Lady Bermudez. And I don't think it'll come as a big surprise to anybody that we ended up purchasing both of Hydrangea's Pepe Jijon coffees, as a lot of people know that I'm a big fan of Pepe and his work. One more note I did have about this coffee is that it does have fellow coffee YouTuber Brian Quan's name on there. So I do believe that he was involved in this project in some capacity. So I wanted to give a shout out to Brian as well as Bill from Hydrangea if he's watching this video, as he did comment on our previous Hydrangea review. Definitely looking forward to discussing this one, as this right here is day 36. And recipe we went with for this coffee was actually our April recipe, which is a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 95 degrees Celsius, about 203 degrees Fahrenheit. And I did like it best through the April dripper, which does indicate a more medium fine grind. Now, roast profile for this one, it's always going to be a little bit more tricky to tell when it comes to these heavier processed coffees, so a natural processed coffee. Bill did comment in our previous review that he does roast, as he describes it, a shade lighter than a lot of the Nordic coffee roasters. This one isn't necessarily on the lightest side of things, so I would say probably best alignment would be on the more developed side of a light coffee for this one. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 11, first impression, ran it through the V60, and it was perhaps a slight bit more vibrant than expected, even with it being a natural processed coffee. There was a slight funkiness to the cup that was reminiscent of the 2020's Paraíso coffees, though it was slightly more refined, cleaner, and a little bit more rounded in general. Prominent in a citric sense, so overall it was a pretty good first impression. But we continue on to day 14. As I ran it through the Chemex, and I could instantly tell that this was probably not going to be the best brew method for this coffee, as it seemed to accentuate a lot of the more fermenty aspects of this one while diminishing the clarity, offering a slightly more grainy quality to the cup and a slight Sidra-like citric component underneath all of that. So not necessarily the best. We were still going to at least try it one more time with this brew method, but I feel like I could tell already from that first impression with the Chemex that this probably wasn't going to be the way to go. Day 16, ran it through the April dripper, and the cup was the best it had been to this point so far, as it did offer some significantly better structure and less of the grainy fermentiness from the previous day. While it was still present, it was definitely less pronounced, as there was a little bit more of a sweeter citric component on this one. So it was okay. I think the first impression was maybe slightly better, but as this coffee did age, it did seem to skew a lot more on the heavier side of things. Day 18 went with some lower temperatures and a higher concentration, and the cup was mildly better. There is still a bit of the fermenty, grainy citric quality to the cup. It is better upon cool down, as there was a slightly more defined orange aspect within the cup. But even at this time, I could kind of tell that this wasn't necessarily the type of coffee that I enjoy, but we persisted, as on day 22, ran it through the Chemex at some higher temperatures and was really struggling with this coffee. And as I mentioned, we were going to probably try it one more time, but this impression of the coffee wasn't any better, as there was definitely much more of that grainy quality to the cup. Also, a fair bit of the fermentiness and even a bit of smokiness was present through this brew method on this day. Some very soft orange hidden underneath all of this coffee, but overall it was still a very heavy cup. Day 25 made some significant adjustments in an attempt to tone down this coffee with a diluted ratio, further decreased the temperatures, and the cup was still offering a fermenty citric forward cup. Still heavy and robust overall, still a little bit of struggle with the cup, as it felt a little harsh in general. So at this time I was really just kind of struggling with this coffee. So on day 29, I decided to go all out, ramped the temperatures up as high as possible, went more fine on the grind to see what I could obtain from this coffee. And it was a slight bit all over the board, as it was best to wait until the coffee did cool down. But even then, the most notable thing was a pretty distinct citric aspect to the cup with a strong lemon. After an extended cool down, grainy quality yet again, slight fermenty tart berry aspects to it, a slightly bitter herbality, some fermenty stone fruits, a robust chocolate smokiness, all in a very long-lasting finish. So not necessarily my favorite, and I said, you know what, we had a lot of success with day 16. Why don't we go back, try it one more time through the April dripper, and that's exactly what I did. And it was just better. I don't know what it is about that specific brew method, but that's by far the best I was able to enjoy of this coffee, as it did balance out so many of the heavy aspects, as all of them were toned down in a significant measure. Much more clarity to the cup, a brighter citrus, and I could even say that it was a little like a pineapple candy on this day. So once again, that day 16 mark, that day 32 mark, best experiences I'd had, both consistent with the same brew method. The other ones, some hit or miss results, especially when it came to the Chemex. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And I think one thing I do have to say is that this tasting wheel was made with the V60 on that second to last day that we did have. So we have 2 level 5s. We'll go through those real quick. And we'll start with the finish. Level 5, yes, this is one of those coffees where I say that it does have a very long lasting and in a certain sense for me overbearing finishes to the cup, and it definitely did seem to linger a fair bit. So after I've taken that sip, I'm definitely going to be tasting this coffee for an extended period of time. Don't necessarily enjoy when a coffee reaches that level 5 mark unless it's a type of finish that matches a really high level of clarity. Citrus fruit, level 5. Yes, and that's one of the first things I did hone in on within this coffee, as it was present throughout. I think that there was a lot of citric aspects, and I mentioned quite a few of them throughout this video. But I do have to say that for the entirety of this coffee, it's one of the most defining factors within it, and it was very significant, abundant, and strong for the entirety of the time drinking this one. Then we have a bunch of level 4s. We'll start with the sweetness, level 4. The sweetness at a level 4 is always an interesting thing, because if it's a type of sweetness I don't necessarily enjoy, then that's going to make it a little bit tricky when it is in a higher margin. So having the sweetness at a level 4 isn't necessarily my favorite part of this coffee. It is a natural processed coffee, so it was skewing in, well, a little bit of that citric direction that I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of. Still definitely on the sweeter side of things. Acidity, level 4. Yes, there was a lot of brightness to this coffee. I think that was expected right from the onset. Honestly, if I had to anticipate where this coffee would have gone based off of what little I do know about this coffee roaster, I was fully expecting the acidity to be one of the higher things experienced within this coffee, so I don't think that comes as a surprise. Stone fruit, level 4, yes. And one of the first things I mentioned in this coffee was that it was slightly reminiscent of the 2020s Paraíso coffees. And those coffees did have this kind of interesting, like slightly fermenty mango aspect to them. And that's what I was experiencing on the first day. And it's one of those things where it was a little tricky to experience, but when you're able to let the coffee cool down a little bit and you're really kind of paying attention, then I was able to bring that specific profile back to this coffee, and it was in, well, significant enough measure to justify that level 4 mark, because aside from the citrus fruits, that's the second fruit component, and honestly one of the other just experiences overall that I did have with this coffee. Then we have a bunch of level 3s. The florality level 3, I do believe, I'm not going to lie, I don't remember what the notes were on here, orange blossom and hibiscus. Okay, so we do have a couple of floral notes on here, but even then I think that the florality was a little bit more hidden relative to the other more distinct, strong citric aspects to it. They list complex citrus on here. Yes, you could say that, and I think it just did kind of overpower the rest of the coffee in terms of what you're able to experience on the forefront. And given, well, we'll discuss it later, the clarity not necessarily being the highest, it didn't necessarily make for a very easy job detecting a lot of those other aspects within this one. Spice level 3, salt level 3, berry fruit level 3. Yes, I did experience at least a significant margin in all 3 of those things, which not necessarily my favorite, especially when it's kind of a little bit all over this tasting wheel to begin with. Berry fruit is, I think, the level 3 that might be worth discussing a little bit, as it did have a fair bit of that kind of fermenty aspect that you experience. People just describe it as generic red berries, but yes, that was something I did experience with this coffee a lot. Chocolate level 3 wasn't necessarily the cleanest chocolate in general, but there was a chocolate-like aspect. I think I'm kind of attributing that one to maybe the origin within this coffee, South American coffee. And then a bunch of level 3s on this end too. Smokiness, level 3. I did mention that there was an interesting smoky quality to this one as well. So the roast profile on this one's a little tricky. And I think that the more I ramped up the temperatures, the more I was able to experience this one. And don't forget that when I made this tasting wheel, this is when I experimented with pushing the extraction as much as I could on this coffee. So I think that's part of the reason why I was experiencing some of these things in more abundance than typical. Bitterness level 3, yes, there was a lot of citric bitterness to this one, so don't have too much to say on that. Savoriness level 3, I do think that goes with the florality, as there was a kind of interesting savory herbal aspect within this one. I think that was maybe a little expected given the notes that were on this one, as well as the processing method, so I could definitely see that there. Body, level 3. Yes, this had a little bit more texture than maybe I would have expected. Sidra is an interesting variety. I know some people are a big fan of it, but I have kind of mixed feelings on it in general. So having that there at the level 3, I didn't know if it would reach that mark, but it definitely had enough texture, and it could have been attributed to maybe the brewing method that we went with for this tasting wheel, but still a fair bit of body in this cup. And then the last, the most important thing we must discuss is the cleanliness, level 2. And I do want to say that with the April, I might be able to bump it up to the lower side of level 3, but let's start from the beginning. This is a natural processed coffee, so that's typically what I've experienced with more modern natural processed coffees, is that they do reach that level 2 mark most of the time. Sometimes they're even less clean than that. Sometimes they go all the way down to a level 1. And every so often you do get a level 3, rarely these days, especially when it comes to Central and South American coffees. I see a lot of them in terms of natural processed coffees reaching that level 3 or 4 mark. So this one right here is, I think, probably in line with the expectation, even though it was maybe on the slightly cleaner side of things. First impression, I do think that the more this coffee had time to rest, the more that it really did seem to open up in a direction that I wasn't necessarily looking for. I did watch Brian and Bill's video on roasting these coffees, and it sounded like there were 2 samples, and one of which didn't necessarily have the same sort of vibrancy. And I think that's the type of natural I'm looking for, because I don't need all of these really strong, overpowering flavors if it's at the sacrifice of clarity. And I think that's the coffee that maybe they opted to go with for this one, and I think I probably would have liked the other version of it better, but kind of looking at this tasting wheel, honestly, this is a pretty accurate representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Let me start with this. I've heard a number of people discussing this one, and a lot of them said that they really enjoyed it. So take my feedback with a grain of salt, as I went into this coffee knowing that this isn't necessarily my type of coffee to begin with, as I'm not the biggest fan of the Sidra varietal, and I do tend to have a much stronger preference towards wash processed coffees in general. And I mostly purchased this coffee out of curiosity, as I've never had any of Pepe's Sidra coffees. So definitely stay tuned for our review of their Mejorado coffee, as that one is much more in line with my preferences. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, though, is anybody that does enjoy their Sidra coffees, as this one seemed to have a lot of those in a much more accentuated and pronounced manner, as it did skew pretty heavily in the citric direction, offering a lot of vibrant citric aspects to this coffee. In addition to that, people that do enjoy their slightly more heavily processed coffees in general, because this one did have a lot more of those heavily processed characteristics, that of course being a much more long-lasting and vibrant cup in general. And honestly, I think that's just kind of the best way I can leave this coffee and this review in general. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Pepe Jijon, natural processed Ecuador from Hydrangea Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.